As Russia massed over 100,000 troops on the border of eastern and northern Ukraine, fears of an invasion began to take hold over the Western world. U.S. intelligence, for weeks, had been warning of a Russian invasion into Ukraine. To Ukrainians, this seemed alarmist. Russia had massed troops on and off their border over and over again for nearly a decade. This time, however, on February 24th, 2022, 100,000 Russian soldiers crossed the border from Russia to Ukraine and began marching on major cities in the east. Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Kiev. U.S. intelligence had been right. The Russians had invaded. But this doesn't tell the whole story. And if you are living in a Western nation like the United States, you might not know more than what's been stated in Western media since February of 2022. While the U.S. media may have our nation believing that the war in Ukraine began in 2022, that isn't true. This conflict actually dates back to a starting point of late 2013 with the Euromaidan protests. When then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych backed out of an ongoing negotiation to integrate Ukraine politically and economically further into the EU after pressure from Moscow. What followed was an uprising now named the Maidan Protest Movement. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets all over western Ukraine to protest Yanukovych's decision. Then came months of civil unrest, buildings torched, and, with the help from the United States government, a new regime put into place in Ukraine. While many in western Ukraine were sufficed, many in eastern Ukraine were not. Tensions rose even further in the following months post-Yanukovych's ousting. In Crimea and in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian separatists clashed with Ukrainian nationalists. What came next was a Russian military occupation of Crimea and a military intervention into eastern Ukraine, both on behalf of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians who live there. This is where the war in Ukraine really started. From this initial conflict rose paramilitary forces on the pro-Russian front and paramilitary forces on the pro-Ukrainian front, the latter forces being trained and funded by the United States government. But who are they? Who exactly is gaining billions in funding from the wealthiest nation on the planet? Since the war's drastic escalation in early 2022, news of the Nazi group Azov Battalion has gone mainstream. It is no longer a secret that the paramilitary group who's been fighting Russian-backed separatist forces in eastern Ukraine are Nazis. Their members wear Nazi paraphernalia, they share a Nazi ideology, and they have, since 2014, been suppressing Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donetsk province, all by the dollar of Governor Serhiy Taruta. But Serhiy isn't the only one financing these new Ukrainian Nazis. Since at least 2015, reports have come out showcasing that, despite what the United States government says, they have been financing the Azov Battalion. Not only financing, but training them as well. Per an interview by the Daily Beast from December of 2019, Azov Sergeant Ivan Kharkiv told reporters that there are many volunteers from the U.S. out in eastern Ukraine training them, medics, engineers, and even soldiers. He went on to say that some volunteers even stay with the Azov Battalion after their time is up to help fight the Russian separatists. Kharkiv went on even further to state that his battalion receives training from foreign armed forces from all over the world. Officially, the United States passed legislation in 2015 prohibiting the sale of arms and the training of Ukrainian Nazi battalions. However, they have since admitted that the vetting process is dubious at best. While on record, no Nazis are being trained by U.S. Army personnel in Western Ukraine. There is no way of knowing what private citizens from the United States, who are former U.S. military ops, are training in the East, however. This ambiguity as to whether or not our tax dollars are in fact going to the Nazi Azov Battalion in Ukraine is a twofold issue. Firstly, the legislation passed dictates that the vetting process look for human rights violations, not ideology. This allows for a great deal of leeway into who gets past the vetting process, and, considering many in the Azov Battalion have not yet committed human rights violations, it is safe to say that its members on the whole are probably getting past the United States vetting processes. The second issue is that the same institution who's in charge of the vetting process on the Ukrainian side, the Ministry of Interior, is also the organization that the Azov Battalion directly answers to. The former Minister of Interior, Arsen Avakov, who served under 4 Ukrainian prime ministers, was known for his ties to neo-Nazi organizations, like the infamous Azov Battalion. It was under his tenure that Ukraine's National Guard was formed from various far-right paramilitary groups. Avakov kept close ties with these groups throughout his time in power. All this to say that when conflict escalated in February of 2022, the United States had, in some capacity, been training and funding members of Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion since 2015 at the earliest. Since 2022, however, the United States government's financial backing of Ukraine has gone mainstream, so to speak. Officially, the U.S. has sent tens of billions to the Ukrainian military in aid. There has also been a slew of ex-U.S. military personnel signing up to volunteer on the front lines, and now, as of October, U.S. advisors sent to, quote-unquote, make sure American weapons don't end up on the black market, have begun showing up as well. While our government assures us that the billions in aid are going to a conservative liberal Ukrainian government and not into the hands of Nazis, it's hard not to notice just how many Ukrainian military personnel there are draped in Nazi iconography, including the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, Valery Zaluzny, who was photographed wearing a silver bracelet sporting multiple Nazi symbols just last month.